I know you.
The ADL reports that hate crimes in our major cities have reached a record high this week. Is this possibly a backlash to the rioting that took place all of last month following the police-involved shooting of Dejon Jones?
The FBI says they are now getting involved regarding the 14-page manifesto that has been spreading across social media sites like 8kun, Parler, and Gab. The manifesto is said to contain information possibly linked to the car bombing attacks on 3 courthouses in Virginia over the weekend.
Mass protests are taking place in major cities across Oregon and Idaho this evening against the unprecedented wave of migrating families fleeing the wildfires that have ravaged much of California. Law enforcement believes militia group the Oath Keepers are leading many of the protests.
The ATF has recently announced it uncovered a plot to assassinate the governor of Colorado in a raid on a Fort Collins home yesterday, where they'd found blueprints of the governor's residence as well as a stockpile of illegal and modified firearms.
This just in, there has been yet another bombing at the Capitol building. This brings the total number of bombings up to 7, and 3 separate militia groups have claimed credit. So far, law enforcement has made no official announcement.
The question on everyone's mind.
The question on everyone's mind.
The question on everyone's mind.
The question on everyone's mind is...
The question on everyone's mind is
the
United States on the brink of civil war?
Okay. Those weren't real. Well, not yet, anyways. But they seem like they could be, right? Like, maybe Tim Pool was right all along. Maybe the US is about to enter a civil war. Well, he wasn't right back in 2017 when he said we're entering a cultural civil war between authoritarian SJWs and anti-authoritarian hackers, and he wasn't right when he said we're entering a cultural civil war between mainstream news and alternative news, or when he said we're entering a civil war between the political and the apolitical, or when he said that the cultural civil war had become a full civil war because some activists vandalized Tucker Carlson's house. No, maybe the boy who cried civil war is not the best barometer for civil conflict within the United States, despite it actually feeling like things are heating up these days. Actually, Tim Pool and others looking on the horizon and predicting and maybe even hoping for civil war isn't anything new. Right-wing militia groups, for example, have a long history of predicting, preparing, planning for civil war in the United States. If that surprises you, or you'd like to know more about that, I highly recommend Step Back History's series on the history of the White Power movement, which gives a detailed look at that history. In fact, right-wing extremists calling for civil war is almost an extension of an idea I discussed in a video from 2 years ago. You'll remember, the video explaining why left-wing extremists destroy property while right-wing extremists kill people. Let's take a refresher look at that one.
Right-wing ideologies fail to understand sociology. They don't understand that people are products of their environment. Right-wing ideologies have a very individualistic worldview. They believe that everything you do and have in life is the product of your individual initiative, and because of that, they believe that their problems are caused by the ill intentions and evil actions of individual members of a given community.
Now wait a minute here, you lying commie loon. What you don't seem to realize is we have to stop the radical left from tearing this country apart. They're inviting hordes of illegal immigrants who are all murderers and drug dealers, and maybe some of them are fine people, and BLM is burning down every city in the country. The LGBT community is grooming and transing every child they can get their hands on. They're stealing every election, from local dog catcher to president. These people must be stopped at all cost. No. For one, none of those things are actually happening, which we could get into. But regarding the need for those people to be stopped at all cost, well, it's material conditions that allow one group to oppress another. There's no need to kill anyone in a fight for justice. There's no need for civil war. What's needed is revolution. We need to expropriate the material conditions that allow one group to oppress another. In this way, the drives that cause left-wing extremists to focus on property destruction while right-wing extremists kill people, it's the same logic that causes left-wing extremists to hope for revolution, a reorganizing of society, while right-wing extremists call for civil war, a bloody battle between them and their perceived enemies. But this is sort of a side point which we'll touch on throughout the video. My main point is, you might have noticed, it's not just militia groups and spree shooters and Tim Pool talking about civil war these days. There have been several news articles and books, hell, even a wisecrack video, all asking, is the US heading for civil war? So to answer that question, let's take a look at How Civil Wars Start and How to Stop Them by Barbara F. Walter, which came out on the anniversary of the January 6th Capitol attack in January of 2022. I figure Barbara F. Walter is probably a pretty trustworthy source on this subject, seeing as how she has a PhD in political science, is a professor of political science at the University of California, and has studied civil wars around the world for over 3 decades. To get us started, let's figure out what civil war even is. Walter defines it thusly.
Civil war in the 21st century is distinctly different from civil wars of the past. Gone are the large battlefields, the armies, and the conventional tactics. Today, civil wars are waged primarily by different ethnic and religious groups, by guerrilla soldiers and militias, who often target civilians.
So, if you were thinking, yeah, right, the US isn't going to split into warring states like it did in the 1860s, don't be ridiculous. Well, if you were thinking that, you'd be right. Walter explains that civil wars of that kind are quite rare in modern history, because of advances in travel and spread of information, regional divides, and things like that, which don't allow for such large and clear divisions amongst populations as the Union and the Confederacy. So instead, modern civil wars usually involve groups that are dispersed throughout the population, who form into militias and rebel groups, and engage in sporadic acts of terrorism, assassinations, bombing attacks, and the like. What we'll see later in the video referred to as open insurgency. Anyway, now that we understand what civil war means in the modern context, Walter looks at common factors which seem to lay the groundwork for civil war. Let's call this section How Civil Wars Start. The main factor laying the groundwork for civil war is when a country enters the anocracy range on the polity scale. Okay, so what does that mean? Walter discusses this thing called the polity scale between positive 10, full democracy, and negative 10, full autocracy. See, in positive 10, full democracy, there's enough compromise between competing groups in society that violence between those groups rarely occurs. And at negative 10, aka full autocracy, those in power have enough power to crush their opposition, which is too weak to fight back. So again, violence between groups rarely occurs. However, towards the middle of this scale, when the compromise of democracy breaks down, or when the oppressive power of autocracy begins to slip, specifically the negative 5 to positive 5 range on the polity scale, this range, called anocracy, is where civil wars are likely to occur. As Walter puts it,
one of the best predictors of whether a country will experience a civil war is whether it is moving toward or away from democracy.
She elaborates.
Democratic countries that veer into anocracy do so not because their leaders are untested and weak, like those who are scrambling to organize in the wake of a dictator, but rather because elected leaders, many of whom are quite popular, start to ignore the guardrails that protect their democracies.
Another key factor that lays the groundwork for civil war is factionalism. Strong divides within a country, typically between religious groups, racial groups, ethnic groups, multiculturalism versus monoculturalism, urban versus rural, things like that. For example, the Sunnis and the Shia in Iraq, or the Hutus and the Tutsis in Rwanda. Hey now, don't try and pin this on me. It's the other side that's trying to divide us, pin us all against each other on the basis of race and sex and class, so that they can tear this country apart. Yeah, sure, we do factionalism too, but we don't dehumanize. We want to change your minds or stop you from committing harm. We don't want to kill you in the terrorist acts of a modern civil war. Another factor that can lead to civil war is a loss, or perceived loss, of power by the dominant group in society, meaning reactionaries, something we've discussed a few times on this channel. Walter calls this group Sons of the Soil. People whose ethnic, religious, linguistic, or other characteristics are seen as the rightful dominant characteristics of the country. Real-world examples of this in action include Muslims in the Philippines feeling like they were losing power to the Catholics, or the Serbians in former Yugoslavia feeling like they were losing power to the Croatians. Another factor that can lead to civil war, which I found very interesting, is in regards to economic inequality.
Walter explains that economic inequality is actually inversely correlated with civil conflict. You see, vast inequality means that folks without economic power don't have the means to fight. Meanwhile, the dominant group with their economic power is in a position to maintain that power. This isn't to say that economic inequality is good, actually, because it stops civil wars. No, what this actually means is that if you already have those other factors, like the country has slid into the anocracy zone, and factionalism and reactionary tendencies are on the rise, then higher levels of economic equality mean that those conflicting groups in society have enough economic power to fight on behalf of their faction, leading to the possibility of civil war. Another factor that makes civil war possible is environmental catastrophes. This is because environmental catastrophes can cause migration, which can exacerbate conflicts between sons of the soil reactionary types, as they feel a sense of loss of power between themselves and the invading outsiders. Another factor that can lead to civil war is the government's response to protests. When people protest and the government makes some concessions, this can appease the protesters and avoid conflict. But if the government responds by bringing out the police or National Guard or military to crack heads or shoot protesters in the street, then people lose hope in peaceful solutions to their grievances and see violence as the only option. Some examples of this that Walter brings up are in Syria, where Assad had soldiers fire on peaceful protesters, leading to civil war, or in the Israeli-Palestine conflict, where the absence of action in response to protest causes folks to turn to violence as the only way to push for one's demands. And, at the time of making this video, we're seeing similar activity in Iran, as massive anti-government protests spread throughout the country, with protesters chanting "death to the dictator," as the Iranian government refuses to make concessions and continues to beat and murder protesters. Will the Iranian government maintain its autocratic control and stomp out the protests without making any change? Will the government comply with the protesters to appease the movement? Or will both sides remain strong in their opposition to each other, thus potentially leading to civil war? Speaking of protests destabilizing a government, elections can be a destabilizing factor as well. For example, the election of Abraham Lincoln was followed by the reactionaries in the South kicking off the destabilization of the US, which led to civil war. Walter explains that this is most likely to occur in winner-take-all democracies, where representation is not proportional and large oppositional factions can feel unrepresented despite having a democratic government. Anyway, those are the key factors that can lay the groundwork for civil war. Next, Walter discusses some things that can exacerbate or even exploit those factors. For example, what Walter calls the accelerant, that being social media. Now, if you've been on YouTube as long as I have, you might remember this old series called RSA Animate. Well, one of the RSA Animate videos was about the internet and democracy. The video explains that there had been this utopian idea that more access to information would inevitably promote democracy and human rights around the world. But if we look historically, the opposite seems to be the case. The access to information from the radio, for example, was integral for the spread of hateful propaganda during the Holocaust and the Rwandan genocide. And we see the same here with the internet. In Myanmar, the spread of hateful propaganda on Facebook helped accelerate the Myanmar Civil War. The propaganda around election fraud claims online fueled the fires that led to the January 6th insurrection in the US. Walter says she sees this pattern over and over again. Social media accelerating factionalism and leading to violence. Walter clarifies that the problem is not with social media itself, necessarily, but how social media makes its money through the engagement and attention economy, through clicks and shares. What gets clicks and shares? Well, outrageous material, of course. It's not the C-SPAN level dry reporting of the news of the day that gets clicks. No, it's the Ben Shapiro's and the Steven Crowder's and the Alex Jones's who are telling us that trans groomers are molesting your kids, climate change is a hoax, mass shooters are part of a secret government plot. Arguments that deepen factionalism and hatred amongst the population. And this brings us to another concept discussed a lot in this book, what Walter calls violence entrepreneurs, those who exploit failed protests or elections or misinformation to bring people to violent solutions. She explains that authoritarians used to have to ride into power on violent coups, but with social media, even democracies can usher in these leaders, not through military coups, but by sowing doubt in the government and
in media and in institutions, exploiting and accelerating tensions through social media. Again, I recommend checking out Step Back History's series on the White Power movement, where Tristan discusses the way these fringe militia groups don't only use the internet to access funding and recruitment and share information on military tactics and bomb making and things like that. They also use social media as an accelerant. They work to radicalize the population in general. Social media allows extremist groups to promote a general distrust of institutions, the idea that moderates aren't doing enough, that the world is ending, that their opposition must be stopped at all cost, that violence is the only option. In fact, in this way, Tim Pool is an intentional or probably unintentional useful idiot for right-wing militia groups when he claims that this or that action or policy by Democrats or progressives will cause an apocalyptic fall into civil war. Anyways, that essentially covers the Why Civil Wars Start of the book's title. Just to recap, that was the anocracy zone of the polity scale, where the peaceful compromise between groups through democracy begins to fail, or when the autocratic control by the dominant group begins to fail and the country has entered the anocracy zone. When factionalism is increased between religious, racial, ethnic groups, or between distinctions such as multiculturalism versus monoculturalism, urban versus rural populations, and things like that. The loss or perceived loss of power by sons of the soil reactionaries, and or sufficient economic and political equality among competing factions, ensuring that one does not easily overpower the other, but instead both sides have the means for violent conflict. And again, all of this can be exacerbated by environmental catastrophes, political catastrophes, and violent entrepreneurs stoking the flames. But is any of this taking place in the United States? This brings us to the second section of this video. Let's call it U.S. Civil War 2.0 question mark? Here, Walter looks at the factors that lead to civil war and names to what extent they are present currently in the United States. Let's start with the first factor, anocracy. Walter explains that Trump's refusal to relinquish power was not unlike what other leaders had done in their countries, which then plunged their countries into civil war. Walter argues that this act by Trump caused the United States to slip so far from democracy that it entered the anocracy zone for the first time in 200 years. She clarifies, though, that institutional pushback helped save the country from Donald Trump, namely that the FBI investigated various militia groups involved in the January 6th insurrection, that Trump appointed judges throughout the phony election fraud claims, that top military officials sided with the Constitution over the former president, and things like that. That said, it is impressive, for lack of a better word, that the US was able to slip so far from democracy into the anocracy zone in just 5 years. Moving on to factionalism. Walter talks about factionalism throughout US history, from the Founding Fathers' federalism and class factionalism to things like the Civil War, Civil Rights Movement, rural and urban divide, isolationism versus globalization, things like that. And Walter argues that the US has not been this strongly divided by factionalism since the Civil Rights Movement. What about Sons of the Soil reactionaries? To this, Walter takes a look at some of the founding myths of the US. White pilgrims seeking religious freedom, the Founding Fathers' Enlightenment values, manifest destiny, saving the world in World War I and II, a history of white folks in positions of economic and political power. That was until Barack Obama became the first black president. The play Hamilton has all the Founding Fathers played by people of color. Non-white births now outnumber white births for the first time in US history. And on top of all this, white folks in Middle America are seeing their standard of living decline for the first time in US history. That's all to say, there's plenty of things that Sons of the Soil reactionary types can point to when they claim that their rightful place as leaders and chief beneficiaries of economic and political power in the US is under attack. Walter adds that there are ethnic factional entrepreneurs in action exacerbating the situation. For example, Donald Trump, making a political name for himself with the birther movement, which claimed that President Obama was a secret non-citizen, Muslim, Kenyan, anti-American, antichrist, depending on how deep down that conspiracy rabbit hole you wanted to go. And Trump maintained this ethnic factional entrepreneurship
throughout his presidential campaign and presidency, as he called for making America great again, build the wall, Muslim ban, bring the factories back to rural America, all those appeals to the sons of the soil. And it's not just Donald Trump, this is seen all over right-wing media as well, from mainstream voices like Tucker Carlson, to alternative media like Ben Shapiro or Steven Crowder, or lesser-known, more obscure figures, spreading various conspiracy theories such as white replacement, QAnon, myths about LGBT grooming, and things like that. But okay, so there's no guarantee that civil war is on the horizon, but the key factors that lay the groundwork for civil war seem to be present and accounted for in the US. Walter then looks at the timeline of modern civil wars and sees how the US stacks up. Let's call this section Steps in the March Toward Civil War. First, the pre-insurgency phase. Walter argues that the United States entered the pre-insurgency phase in the 90s with the original formation of militia groups, Oklahoma City bombing, and the shootout in Waco, Texas. Again, for a more detailed look at this history, I recommend Step Back History's series on the White Power movement, where Tristan actually dates the rise of these right-wing militia groups to as early as the 70s, when right-wing anti-communist Vietnam War veterans returned to a civil rights battle-stricken US, and they formed racist and anti-communist militia groups. Anyways, Walter argues that there was this huge surge of militia groups in the US in 2008 after the election of Obama, and that although historically militia groups were left-wing, such as the IWW, Weather Underground, the Black Panthers, or whatever, from the 90s onward, most militia groups were right-wing, with the two biggest groups, the Oath Keepers and the Three Percenters, forming after the election of President Obama. So it would appear that the US passed the pre-insurgency phase sometime between the 90s and the Obama years. The next stage is what is called the incipient conflict stage. Walter explains that in 2012, there were about 16 violent right-wing attacks, but by 2020, the number rose to over 60, a historic high.
Since the early days of the internet, far-right extremists have been responsible for around 700 terrorist attacks worldwide. And from 2015 to 2019, the number of far-right attacks has grown to over 60 every year.
I mean, you've seen the news. That club in Oklahoma that was firebombed after hosting a drag show, the various election officials and staff that have faced threats and harassment, the militia group that tried to kidnap Governor Whitmer, the FBI agents who were targeted and harassed after a search warrant was carried out at Trump's residence, the militia groups in the Midwest that wrote up a kill list of various politicians, the guy who tried to assassinate Nancy Pelosi with a hammer, the January 6th insurrection? Maybe the US really is in the throes of this incipient conflict stage. Anyway, the next stage is called the open insurgency stage. This is where the country is experiencing sustained attacks by the terrorist group. This is what I was kind of spoofing at the start of the video. Walter actually has a similar section in her book as well. However, and I don't know if this is her trying to be nonpartisan or maybe she's just a liberal or something, her examples included attacks from both right-wing and left-wing groups, which I already explained doesn't make any sense. Hey, yeah, why is she dragging me into this? I'm not trying to start a civil war. I just want to revolutionize society. I want to make society better for everyone. I'm not trying to kill anybody. You're not trying to kill anyone. You're trying to kill America. You're trying to kill liberty. You're tearing this country apart, and you must be stopped. But really, to play devil's advocate with this open insurgency stage, let's look back at the height of the rioting between BLM protesters and Antifa folks and various right-wing militia groups and the US government themselves, all of the police. Wasn't all of this a sort of low-level open insurgency isolated to those particular city streets where the rioting was taking place, where residents were kind of being asked to side with the protesters, the counter-protesters, or the police? Maybe. Anyways, Walter argues that in the open insurgency stage, the militia groups have three goals. First is to outdo their moderate competitors, be more militant, more extreme, more violent, more fanatical than other groups on their side. The second goal is to thwart compromise, to keep moderates on their side from working with the opposition. The final goal is to wear down their opposition through a war of attrition.
aka scaring them and wearing them down through threats, harassment, terrorist attacks, kidnappings, murders, and the like. This brings us to... and how to stop them. Civil wars, I mean, obviously. We're referring to the title of the book. One thing that's needed is to weaken factionalism, to get opposing sides talking again. Let's look at a positive example. South Africa. Surely a country we can agree was on the precipice of civil war. And yet, they've freed up the press, re-established previously banned political parties, released political prisoners, and established a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, directly targeting the factionalism within the country. There are a lot of things the US government could do in this regard. Ranked choice voting, liquid democracy, proportional representation, and all that good stuff. Walter proposes some solutions that other countries have already implemented, which I think we could all get on board with. Elections ran by an independent commission, automatic voter registration, eliminate gerrymandering, which encourages extremism as candidates try and stand out from others in their party, get rid of the Electoral College, which exacerbates the factionalism between the rural and urban populations. These solutions would improve trust in democratic institutions and decrease factionalism. Regarding social media, factionalism seems to have gotten a lot worse in recent years, with the current way that social media is being divided into political camps. Parler, Gab, Twitter, Facebook, Mastodon, PeerTube. It's going to be hard to get folks on all sides of the political spectrum talking if their sources of news, information, and communication are all completely different social media platforms. But hey, maybe these social media platforms are gonna destroy themselves. I mean, the US government's interested in targeting TikTok. Mark Zuckerberg seems to be destroying Facebook. Elon Musk seems to be destroying Twitter. Maybe we're on the right track.
Turning citizens into inflammation entrepreneurs for profit is how you destroy democracies. The thing that Elon can do is to change the video game of what Twitter is. Instead of rewarding us for being inflammation entrepreneurs, can he reward us for being consensus and synthesis entrepreneurs?
Another solution that Walter proposes is to improve the economic security and political engagement of citizens. Fears around economic insecurity make folks easy prey for sons of the soil arguments, makes them easy targets for militia groups looking for new recruits. Folks who do work in de-radicalizing skinheads and KKK members and militia members and stuff, they talk about how it's hard for people to turn their backs on their friend groups and support structures. And those extremist groups were able to exploit those needs by prospective recruits because they weren't being met through more positive outlets.
I first started on studying a group of skinheads in Orlando, Florida, and a lot of those young men had their parents laid off at the local textile mill and were wondering what happened to the American dream. That's something a lot of people are experiencing right now.
So, Mr. President, senators, congresspersons, I know many of you are fans of the show, and I hope you've made time to watch this video. Let me address you directly. I know you're interested in fighting right-wing terrorism. Well, those of you who are not actively encouraging it, that is. Well, then you should improve the economic standing of our most vulnerable citizens. And there's so many ways you could do this. You could pass some more infrastructure bills, reinstitute the child tax credit, get some jobs programs going, invest in social services and education, tie minimum wage to inflation. There are so many things you could do to improve people's lives and educational attainment, and undermine the recruitment of right-wing extremist groups in the process. Now wait a minute here. That all sounds wonderful, but who's gonna pay for it? Think about the deficit. This reeks of socialism. Vuvuzela! Ah yes, investing in America's future, creating better educational and economic opportunities for Americans. How could that ever pay off? Are you even listening to yourself right now? Walter's solution here is a little bit corny in my opinion. She says we should have a civic Saturday where people come together like a secular church service and they all say the Pledge of Allegiance together. They all talk about how great America is. That's so bad. It's very, how do you do, fellow citizens? As dorky as that sounds, my solution is somewhat similar. If you or someone you know is getting most of their social interaction from extremist political groups, it's probably healthy to join something in your local community and make friends with differing opinions that you can shoot the breeze with. Join a local softball team or D&D group or volunteer at your local soup kitchen or food bank or whatever.
It's not always easy, especially when some of these extremist groups want their adherents to have an almost cult-like rejection of everyone outside the group.
How does one leave the white supremacist movement?
It's actually really difficult, not only for security issues, and fear for your life, but also because when you become a part of this movement, you give up everything that's important to you. And this is the only identity, community, and purpose that you have.
Black-pilled incel forums, militia groups, QAnon is a big proponent of this. And this isolation from everyone else outside one's group puts the members on the road to dehumanizing their opposition and seeing violence against them as the only option. But it doesn't have to be that way. I mean, take me for example. I have ran a radical anarchist YouTube channel for years. Many of my social interactions are anarchist Reddit boards, anarchist YouTube channels, Socialist Rifle Association events, punk shows, protests. I would be ripe for getting lost on the sauce and having no understanding or empathy with my political opponents. But I do plenty of going to bars, going out for a bite to eat, going to parties or various events in town with coworkers, friends, and family members, many of whom hold ideas about the world very different from my own. Now, I think my ideas about the world are correct, and I have the research and evidence and arguments to back that up. But still, these real-world connections to folks of all different kinds of beliefs and lifestyles is very important for staying grounded, you know? So if you're wondering what you could do to stave off civil war, outside of voting and volunteering and stuff, make sure that you stay grounded and keep in contact with coworkers and friends and family members with differing political opinions. Not only for yourself, but also for them. Maybe there would be fewer right-wing militia members and QAnon folks chomping at the bit to murder their political opponents if their friends and coworkers and family members had ties to those communities and explained what they stand for and why, building empathy and understanding. And I think Walter agrees with me here when she concludes,
America faces a monumental challenge to create a truly multi-ethnic democracy, one that can survive and thrive as global migration continues to mold the country's demographics and identity. To fulfill the promise of a truly multi-ethnic democracy, the nation must navigate deep peril. We need to shore up our democracy, stay out of the anocracy zone, and rein in social media, which will help reduce factionalism. This will give us a chance to avoid a second civil war.
It's like better diversity destroys factionalism and improves community. Perhaps diversity really is our strength. And hey, if you live in the US and I managed to somehow get this video out before Turkey Day, have fun reaching across the aisle and discussing differing ideas around the dinner table. Anyway, as always, I'd like to thank my wonderful patrons. Your tremendous support has allowed me to get dog insurance, which is wonderful. You've allowed me to support other creators I couldn't otherwise support. Gotta love that. You provide me with little extra funds for books and dog toys and things like that, which is awesome. I appreciate you folks a lot. If you like what I do here and you want to support the show, you can go to patreon.com/radicalreviewer. And if you're interested in radical theory, looking for a book recommendation or whatever, you can get your radical reviews here with the Radical Reviewer. Thanks for watching.
Seize entire cities, yeah, or regions of a country. Abolish all police, religion, private property. We've done it before, united, we cannot be stopped. Then we'll all get lined up and shot. But fascists are just communists and liberals who've been waiting all along to be the fascist cops.
It didn't start out as hateful at first. It started out with playing on my feelings of pride, of being Italian, of being European. And then eventually, as time went on, they would find somebody to blame for taking that pride away from me. And they would blame everybody from Jews to gays to blacks. And I believed it because I wanted to belong so badly. Mm-hmm. But what I got out eventually was I started to receive compassion from the people I least deserved it from when I least deserved it. People that I thought I hated started to show me empathy and compassion. And I started to humanize them. And it was the first time I had a meaningful interaction with the people I thought I hated.